Just a bit about me first. I'm a senior lecturer at Teeside University. Thanks for Keith for inviting me along. Basically, I work at Teeside as a sports psychologist, but I've also got a background in ecological theory because my PhD was in perception action coupling in goal-directed locomotion. So I've got a foot in both camps. Recently, I've done work on flow, and I've been talking to Keith about how maybe some of the ideas I've got around flow and knowledge around ecological dynamics can be used to be applied for sports psychologists as practitioners. Because obviously as a sports psychologist, I've done my CPD as part of the BPS, and it's ongoing. And as part of an applied sports psychologist, you do the traditional framework, which is dominated by cognitive behavioural therapy, psychological skills training, for example. And as we all know, that involves taking the athlete away from their training environment to apply psychological skills. So I have become quite critical of that. So I spoke to Keith about it, and as I've got one foot in ecological psychology, I'm quite happy to, be critical of the psychological skills training approach and look at how that we can actually not persuade sports psychologists to have a more ecological approach, but how we can actually put out our views. So this presentation is basically an outline of an opinion paper which is going to be sent out shortly. Okay, so as I said, I'm a sports psychologist and I've worked with athletes in different applied settings, quite a lot with swimmers, various different types of track and field athletes. So what I outline first is the traditional kind of theoretical model which sports psychologists tend to use as a justification and rationale for their applied work. So I'll talk a bit about that. And then I'll go into why, in my opinion, we need a theory that needs to emphasise ecological self-regulation. Okay? Traditional psychologists have got theories around self-regulation, but they're not ecological. And then I'll look at just some speculation around what that means for applied work for sports psychologists and how perhaps they can use those ideas to maybe make their consultations a bit more ecologically sound. Okay, so this is just a framework model which is quite typical, which will be used by traditional sports psychologists as a kind of guideline for their applied work. So I should expect most of you are quite familiar with the general kind of organisation. You have the athletic event here, and then you have the individual who appraises that particular demand, whether they can meet that demand, primary and secondary appraisals. And the idea here is that those primary and secondary appraisals of an event, real or not, generate some kind of emotional response which then may need to be dealt with by some kind of coping strategy. Okay? So we're all fairly familiar with that. And then the idea is that depending on the emotional response, which is typically if the demand exceeds the resources the individual has to deal with the event, then if it's a certain amount of anxiety trait or state, then the idea is to help the individual with various psychological strategies to help reduce that anxiety to a manageable level, which will hopefully facilitate performance. And obviously down in these boxes here you've got some mediating factors. There's lots of research around the role of those mediating factors. Obviously, we can argue that some people, they have lower amounts of cognitive anxiety, other people have higher amounts of cognitive anxiety. And it's probably fair to say that this model, its main kind of aim is to kind of diagnostic approach, so that to fit people in within a particular type of constellation of states or traits of anxiety, then you can decide what type of intervention may best be suited for them, like the matching hypothesis, for example. So this can be used in an applied sense, but from an ecological point of view, it's limited. Another kind of quite familiar kind of trend within traditional sports psychology is to concentrate on a narrow range of emotions. So again, it's quite common to see a lot of work on anxiety, okay, to the detriment of other types of emotions which we know would be involved when people are exploring unfamiliar, unknown territory. Okay? Not everyone is equally anxious in a trait or state sense. Some people with low cognitive anxiety will have a lot of excitement about maybe being in a situation where they don't know what's going to happen next, and there's a lot of people watching. But the traditional sports psychology approach doesn't give a lot of attention to those emotions. Instead, what you get is this type of emphasis on negative emotions, as it were, as something which the sports psychologist has to treat in some way via some kind of strategies. And those strategies are normally away from the competition and training environment. So overall general kind of meta-theoretical principles of the traditional approach. The idea is or assumption is that the athlete has an internal control system which the psychologist can help them understand by view of educating them about the consequences of different types of anxiety and what somatic differences between somatic and cognitive anxiety. And via some kind of insight, that individual can gain control of their emotions within an optimal range which will allow them to perform as best they can in the environment. So it's really emphasising typically, but not always typically, the idea of an optimal constellation of traits which an individual can get if they are more aware of themselves. So this leads to perhaps a cold understanding of cognition in the sense that the relationship between the appraisals and the emotions is seen as separate. But we know in real life they're not separate, okay? They're inseparable. And to be fair, if you look at a lot of Lazarus's early writings with regards to the cognitive motivational relational theory, he did say all of this acts together as one unit in real life. He didn't mean for cognition to be separate from emotions. But when you do consultations as a sports psychologist, it's very difficult not to fall into the trap of starting to talk to the athlete as if cognitions and emotions really are separate. Okay? So this leads to perhaps unwittingly, a lot of times when people talk about the applied work they do and they reflect on it as psychologists, they talk about emotions as discrete emotions, just occurring in real time in the sense of the way we talk about emotions in terms of categories, when in fact different emotions rise and fall very quickly in athletic performance and in preparation. So there's been a lot of criticism on this linear relationship between the appraisals and the cognitive response and the coping. And, well, does it really work like that? A lot of people will admit in private it doesn't really, but for the sake of justifying their practice, they'll talk as if it does. So really, these models, I mean, those, the framework which I showed was really influenced by Hanning, the ITOF model. And that model really is about trying to predict an individual's emotional state so that therefore the psychologist can know or perhaps make a good educated guess as to what type of strategy that person will need. And so the emphasis is on control. Controlling your emotions in order to facilitate the correct motor response. The idea being that emotions are something to reduce the variability with, because that variability cannot be used by the motor system, and if it's too much variability, then there will be interference to a detrimental effect. So the assumption is it's a hierarchical model. If you treat the mind, the body will follow. So obviously this has led to a lot of interventions and training methods, which psychologists, in a sense, they endorse, whereby the idea is to try and break down learning movements in order to reduce the cognitive load, rather than to actually help the individual deal with whatever load they've got in the situation, so that the movement system and everything else can actually adapt to whatever demands are in place. So, here's just a little short video of an example of that.
Skills we see in top-level batsmen is their ability to make great decisions and judgment around balls that are targeted around the off stump. So players understanding which balls to play at and which balls to leave, especially playing quality balls, seeing the ball, possessing those types of skills is a great asset to any great batsman. So we're going to do a little drill here to show you how you can develop your decision-making skills around balls that are threatening the off-stump region. So Geordie, if you'd like to take your stance, please. Okay, I'd like to bring in another set of stumps and place them next to the wickets, okay? And we're going to give the stumps a number. So, Geordie, if you could just maybe step away just slightly, just so we can show stump 1, okay, middle stump 2, off stump is 3. So, always keep number 3 in mind, alright? Another set of stumps, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, Geordie, what I want you to do is to call what line, okay, you think, okay, as early as you possibly can. Whilst the ball is still in the air, if you can call that number, that's even better. But upon contact and or completion, you just give me a number, okay, and I'll confirm back to you. But you're not allowed turning around and looking at the wickets for this cheating. Okay, so simple there. If the ball's going down the side, just call 0, alright, and we'll move away across. Okay, but I'm going to pull these wickets away. Sometimes though, you can actually leave the wickets here, okay, and with the ball hitting those stumps, that will give a bit of confirmation to the batsman, okay, but that's if the player is really, really struggling to make line identification accurately. Okay, Geordie, let's get into it. Alright, here we're using a bowling machine, so we can get that ball swinging around and make it more difficult for the batsman to make those accurate decisions, but you can use net bowlers, throwdowns, you can do this drill in any instance, okay? So keep that in mind. Let's get the bowling machine humming and nice, loud, positive calling. Geordie? 5, it was. Good identification. Wide of the off stump. 4. Probably 5 again. So there, Geordie, it's nothing to be disappointed about, but getting that confirmation to me, you can just do a little psychological assessment there to obviously develop that intuitive sense and judgment skills of line. Here we go.
I mean, hit it, it's fine. What's the problem?
5, fantastic shot.
Okay, so I'm not problem with that, but I think we all get the idea. I mean, ecologically speaking, it's very questionable. It leaves out a lot of the information which a batter's going to need to predict the ball. But this type of exercise could be rationalised using the framework I've just described, in the sense that the rationale would be, well, you can actually isolate these decision-making procedures and you can take out all of the emotion, you can take out all of the cues from the real situation. So, obviously we don't agree with that approach, and it seems pretty obvious from our point of view. So, consider, so what is self-regulation? I'll come to. So, in a few of the presentations, they've had or mentioned the idea of emotions. So, when I was doing my PhD and looking into Gibson's ideas, there was virtually no explicit mention of emotion. It was almost there was a question mark about, well, where's the agency here? Okay, Gibson talked a lot about information pickup, but there was no real, information was very abstract, but there was no mention of emotion. So, for the last 5 to 10 years, there's been developments in dynamical systems and ecological dynamics into how to integrate emotion, because emotion really is a key thing involved with decision making, with behaviour, with the whole kind of what makes sport exciting. So this idea of emotional perturbation is really much more nuanced and broader than what typically psychologists, when they're using the traditional framework, think about. From the traditional framework, it's quite usual to think about emotions as being involved in modulating how we deal with pressure, for example. But there's lots of different nuances of pressure to do with adaptation and to do with facing the unknown, which aren't to do with variables like, oh, how many people are watching me, or who's in the crowd, or even the consequences of the action. So think of an example like this. A cricket batsman having to prepare and expecting a particular type of bowler may have to unexpectedly face another bowler at a critical point in the match. So again, it's this idea of facing the unexpected when you didn't expect it, or you think your planning is optimal, but really at the last minute you find out there's something uncertain may happen. So this type of adaptation problem is very common, obviously for cricket batters potentially, even though nowadays they can watch YouTube and they might know who the bowler's going to be, so they can do the research beforehand, but sometimes you can imagine they won't always have all the unknowns known. So in that situation, there has to be some kind of willingness to adapt to the situation and accept it for what it is. And I suppose that's why I've come back interested in ecological dynamics, as Keith and others have started to develop the ideas around what actually is involved in adaptation in real time. Okay? Because this isn't something which traditional psychologists really tackle or can tackle easily with their theories. So if a batter came to a psychologist with this type of problem, then typically it could involve a number of strategies. The idea would be to educate the batter in terms of what their response is, in terms of its functionality for experiencing that emotion. And then the assumption would be that if they make or allow the individual to experience that emotion in a more constructive way, then that will automatically lead to improved batting performance. So there's that kind of assumed link between the cognition and the emotion and the motor behaviour. But the actual strategies which a psychologist could use in that situation could be cognitive restructuring, so that involves reappraisal of the situation, maybe as a challenge rather than a threat, some kind of self-awareness of their self-talk, in terms of if they've got any doubts in their mind, to be aware of that, to give them some meta-awareness strategies, so that when they are aware of maybe when they're talking negatively, they can maybe dismiss it in some way. Some visual imagery, batters can apply some kind of imagery beforehand while they're getting ready to help maybe reduce their anxiety, and perhaps some goal setting as well. So, really what you can do, from an ecological point of view, we wouldn't be interested in that reductionist approach. We would want to try and integrate or get the individual to actually perform in a representative environment. And they could do that without actually having to spend a lot of time reflecting. The reflection could maybe come on afterwards, but they wouldn't have to do it prior. They could actually just use knowledge from what they have to do, how they have to adapt, and then give people that experience, and then use that experience as the kind of the intervention strategy, rather than taking people away out of their training environment, talking to them, divorced from that environment, and then trying to apply psychological skills as if individuals are just existing from the neck up. So, obviously from an ecological dynamics perspective, there's lots of factors you could include. These are only some of them. And so the idea would be, from an ecological perspective, was that the movement behaviour would emerge from the interaction of all these factors, and no one of these factors would necessarily be primary. Within the individual's constraints, you would still have cognitions, you would still have developed prediction skills, their emotional tendencies, because that would be an important part of the individual's intrinsic dynamics. So rather than talking about emotions as fixed categorical states, it would be more appropriate in terms of ecological dynamics language to talk about tendencies, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to move the individual to a particular emotional landscape which is more or less stable, which will allow them to perform well in an environment which is meaningful for them. Meta-awareness, I think, is relevant. The work I've done on flow and mindfulness does indicate that some kind of meta-awareness would be important for the athlete, because that will give them some kind of overarching view of when some ideas come into their head, whether to distance themselves from those ideas. And it gives them a level of awareness of their feelings and their somatic anxiety, if it's relevant. And then you have the environmental factors, obviously. Okay, so I did say the last 5-10 years there's been more work on how exactly, in a theoretical sense, we would try and incorporate emotion into dynamical systems. And a lot of these ideas are obviously consistent with what we already know about how constraints work, because emotional tendencies would be a type of constraint which would work and interact with all the other constraints. So a preliminary idea is that emotions, they emerge and they fall away within real-time context, and they change over other time periods as well, obviously developmental time periods. And then, as emotions are part of a complex system, that means those emotions as well, they have multiple levels. And that kind of fits in well with a lot of the traditional ideas in sports psychology, whereby you have emotions which, there's a lot of argument, theoretical arguments in general psychology, but it's been going on for the last 20 years, quite frankly. But you've got people at one end who argue that we have basic emotions which are ingrained through evolution, and they are, in a sense, pre-wired. And then you've got people on the other camp saying, no, it's a lot more flexible than that. Actually, the emotions which people experience are a result of other psychological operations going on. So you've got this fight that's been going on in general psychology between the nativeness at one end and the constructivist at the other. But taken at either extreme, both of them leave out the interaction of nature, of one end and the other. So Mark Lewis has been doing quite a lot of good theoretical work into how maybe dynamical systems can be used to maybe integrate both of those approaches, because both of them together have better explanatory power than either of them alone. So obviously the emotional system, as part of the self-regulatory system, self-organises as a function of cooperations between the components that comprise it. So again, obviously, within ecological psychology, most of you here are familiar with this idea of perception and action. So the idea is that preliminary theoretical or meta-theoretical idea would be that within ecological dynamics, there's no direct emotional regulation, okay? As opposed to a traditional approach where they are trying to regulate emotions, be it indirectly via cognitive appraisals. If we're taking the theoretical point of view that the system acts as a whole when you're in a real environment, and that all the different operations of that system coordinate together, and that the skill movement at the end is the result of lots of different systems working at different time periods, then we have to say that there's no direct emotional self-regulation, because that emotion is just one of the many constraints that are working. Okay? Which doesn't mean that we're saying that emotions aren't important, but what we're saying is there are other things going on as well, and that emotions are only one part of it. So self-regulation is, from this perspective, the emotional and the psychological aspect of the total skill adaptation which takes place. Okay, so again, kind of summary here. Emotions are non-linear and emergent system tendencies in the sense that we're trying to make them as stable as possible, but it's not always possible to make constructive emotions stable. Sometimes, in some situations, athletes will have to work with emotions which are maybe seen as slightly not optimal. But that is the whole point of having an adaptive system, that you can still perform and you can still adapt even when certain emotions or feelings aren't really what you expected. Okay? And that is contrary to really the way generally sports psychologists tend to operate. It's not always the case, but generally that is the case. So emotions are just tendencies, okay, within the action system. There are other constraints which are important. So really what we should be encouraging here, rather than trying to control emotions, we want to get athletes to actually understand that they can perform or they can adapt to performing while experiencing different levels of anxiety or different types of emotion. And that actually is good for their ability to actually face unfamiliar situations and to accept that kind of experience as something which is normal and something which is part of the evolutionary basis of our adaptive system. We don't have to be in the zone, as it were. We don't have to be aiming for this peak performance kind of constellation of characteristics which some sports psychologists unwittingly do encourage. We can actually adapt well, we can perform well, even though we may be experiencing emotions which we didn't expect. So this type of approach can actually help athletes or an educator to see that these changes as normal and to work with them. So again, not preaching to the converted slightly, but development of expertise is dependent on stimulating these emotions and challenges as much as possible and realistically in preparation for competition. So again, Lewis has done some interesting work on time scale and effects, and that's really the bit which is missing theoretically from the traditional model. The model which I got the paper from, that was actually a review paper where they're looking at patterning of emotions, and so there is an acknowledgement amongst psychologists that yes, during preparation for performance, during performance, there is a rise and fall of emotions, and it's not just one fixed emotion of anxiety, intensity, state or trait. But what those theories lack is they lack a kind of acknowledgement as to how the real-time emotion relates to developmental stages of emotion, for example. So speakers today have done presented work on how we can actually present or how we can actually construct a learning environment which is conducive for younger people and adolescents, and to help them experience sport in a way which enables them to grow. So the time scale and effects idea is that type of idea from dynamical systems, whereby you've got certain emotions which may be, to some extent, pre-programmed from evolution, and they operate over a long scale. And then you've got the developmental scale as well, which is slightly shorter, maybe 20 years or so. And then you've got the real-time experience of those emotions. So what Mark Lewis was trying to do in his paper is talk about how those timescales, they interact with each other within the individual. And there's Neil's paper as well, which talks about that in detail. Okay, so I was expecting more sports psychologists here. I think there's only a handful. But really, it's an invitation. You're not going to convert people overnight, and I know there are occupational kind of constraints in terms of the dominant kind of paradigm, as it were. And psychological skills training has its place, okay, for certain types of problems. But when it comes to actually transferring motor skill, which is what a lot of sports psychology interventions are about, then really there should be a different view of how we're trying to actually educate, train, and how we're trying to implement psychological skills within actual representative designs. And emotion shouldn't be seen as something separate, which you can actually educate people about in a meaningful way, away from training and competition. So it's an ongoing question. Again, some of the speakers today have given some good suggestions as to how we can actually incorporate representative design, but we need a more incorporation into how different types of emotions are actually involved in the constraints, and more research on that using this meta theory. Okay, so in summary, ecological dynamics suggests that emotional self-regulation be integrated within an overall set of practices and learning to enhance overall self-regulation. So emotional self-regulation is not a target in itself for, or should be a target in itself for psychological interventions in order to get benefit. So this implies sports psychology is being integrated within a learning design team, which again is a challenging proposition. But I think that's the only way to go, really. Whether it happens in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, that's the way to go. Okay?
Mm-hmm.